you had a difficult childhood, and a lot of us did, there's new research suggesting that history may have shaped when you hit menopause and what that means for your brain decades later. It's not a small connection. It's the kind of finding that makes you rethink what menopause even is.
Hi there, I'm Tony Lee, and this is Hot Flasher, your daily menopause podcast that serves up fresh news, research, and wellness tips. I've built a daily news pipeline to find the latest on women's health and menopause research. Allow me to introduce my co-host, Nikki, who handles the headlines. Take it away, Nikki.
Thanks, Tony. We've got a meaty one today. 3 studies, all pointing at things that tend to get under-discussed even in spaces that are supposedly all about menopause. There's a new paper out of the US, published this year, 2026, researcher Nakanishi, looking at adverse childhood experiences, early menopause, and dementia risk. If you've spent any time in the trauma-informed health space, you've probably heard the term ACEs before. Adverse childhood experiences, things like abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, growing up with a parent who struggled with addiction or mental illness. The ACE framework has been around since the late 90s, and the research connecting high ACE scores to adult health outcomes, cardiovascular disease, autoimmune conditions, mental health, has been building steadily ever since. What this study adds is a link that's more specific to our world. Women with higher ACE scores showed higher rates of early menopause. And early menopause, meaning before age 45, sometimes called premature or early onset, is itself an established risk factor for cognitive decline and dementia later in life. The proposed mechanism isn't mysterious. Estrogen is neuroprotective. The longer your brain goes without it, the more exposure time you accumulate to that estrogen-deprived state. So, if trauma in childhood accelerates the end of your reproductive years, it potentially accelerates the window of neurological vulnerability too. Now, this is observational research. It can tell us that these things are associated, not that ACEs directly cause early menopause or that early menopause inevitably leads to dementia. The relationship is probabilistic, not deterministic, and the study is working with self-reported ACE data, which has its own limitations. People underreport, memories are complicated, definitions of what counts as adverse vary. All of that matters when you're reading this. But here's my actual position on it. I think this research matters even with those limitations because it pushes on something that women's health has been slow to integrate. The idea that your reproductive timeline isn't just genetic, that it's also biological, shaped by stress hormones, by chronic activation of the HPA axis, by what your body learned to do in a childhood that wasn't safe. That's not a fringe claim. The chronic stress early menopause connection has been building in the literature for years. This study extends it into cognitive outcomes and does it in an older US adult sample, which gives it some real-world weight. What it also means, practically, is that women who had difficult early lives and who are now in perimenopause or early postmenopause should probably be having more proactive conversations with their doctors about cognitive health monitoring and about what neuroprotective options exist, including, where appropriate, hormone therapy. The kind of evidence base your doctor would look at on a tool like Open Evidence is increasingly clear that the timing of HRT matters for brain outcomes. Earlier initiation, closer to menopause onset, looks better in the data than waiting. If your menopause came early, that conversation becomes more urgent, not less. The part that stays with me from this study, and this isn't a warm, fuzzy observation, it's a structural one, is that the women most likely to have high ACE scores are also the women least likely to have had consistent, good quality healthcare throughout their lives. Poverty, instability, systems that failed them as kids, those same systems often fail them at midlife too. The research finds the association. The intervention question is harder and messier than any one paper can answer. Completely different clinical territory now. A 2026 review by SAID takes on the urinary symptoms of genitourinary syndrome of menopause, GSM, which is a term you may or may not have heard, and which covers a much wider range of symptoms than most people realise. When people talk about GSM, they tend to lead with vaginal dryness and painful sex. Those are real, they're common, they matter, but the urinary side of GSM is its own substantial story, and it's dramatically undertreated. We're talking about urgency, increased frequency, that feeling that you constantly need to go even when you don't, recurrent urinary tract infections, bladder pain, incontinence. These things affect an estimated 50 to 70% of postmenopausal women, according to the research literature. And a significant portion of them are never told that what they're experiencing is a menopause symptom. What happens instead is that women get referred for UTI treatment that doesn't resolve the problem, or they get told this is just aging, or they quietly start managing their lives around their bladder. Not traveling, not exercising, wearing pads, without ever knowing there are targeted treatments. The pathophysiology here is straightforward. The urinary tract and the vaginal tissue share the same estrogen receptors. When estrogen drops, the mucosa thins, the microbiome shifts, the pH changes, the tissue becomes more vulnerable to irritation and infection. Local estrogen, vaginal estrogen cream, the vaginal ring, vaginal DHEA targets those receptors directly. The systemic absorption is minimal. This is not the same risk profile conversation as systemic HRT. The review by SAD covers the clinical management options in detail, and it's a good one for clinicians to have in front of them. My frustration with the state of things isn't the science. The science here is actually pretty solid and has been for a while. My frustration is the gap between what the evidence supports and what's happening in actual 5-minute appointments. A woman with recurrent UTIs and bladder urgency should be getting a conversation about GSM. She should be hearing that vaginal estrogen exists, that it's low risk for most women and that it works. Instead, a lot of women are getting their third antibiotic prescription of the year for something that isn't fundamentally a bacterial problem. If any of this sounds like your situation, bring the term genitourinary syndrome of menopause into your next appointment. Those words specifically, they're in the clinical literature, and they should trigger a different conversation than I keep getting UTIs. The third study is the one I'd want every woman in perimenopause who has fibroids to know about. This is a 2026 retrospective cohort study by NAJOR, and what it found is that uterine fibroids significantly reduce the sensitivity of ultrasound to detect endometrial cancer, specifically endometrioid and serous subtypes. Ultrasound is the standard first-line imaging for investigating abnormal uterine bleeding, which is also one of the primary symptoms that prompts investigation for endometrial cancer. The logic is you have unusual bleeding, the doctor orders a pelvic ultrasound. Ultrasound looks for abnormal endometrial thickness or suspicious changes. That's the pathway. What this study shows is that when fibroids are present, that pathway has a real blind spot. Fibroids distort the uterine architecture. They create acoustic shadows on imaging. They make it harder to get a clear view of the endometrium. And the result is that cancers, including the more aggressive serous subtype, can be missed or delayed. For context, fibroids are extremely common in perimenopausal women. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 20 and 80% of women will have fibroids by the time they're 50, with higher rates in Black women. So this isn't a rare edge case. This is a substantial population of women going through a diagnostic process that the evidence says may not be reliable enough. The practical implication from this study isn't that ultrasound is useless. It's that it may not be sufficient on its own when fibroids are present. And there's a clinical reason to be concerned about the endometrium. Endometrial biopsy, sonohysterography, or MRI may need to be on the table earlier in the workup rather than as second-line options after an ultrasound doesn't show anything conclusive. This is the kind of finding that should be changing clinical decision-making. Whether it does, quickly enough, broadly enough, is a different question. And the answer to that depends on whether the physicians ordering these ultrasounds are up to date on a 2026 paper that most of them probably haven't read yet. If you have fibroids and you're having any unexplained bleeding, it is worth asking your doctor specifically whether ultrasound alone is going to give them the information they need. You're not being difficult, you're asking a question the research supports. That's a wrap on the week. Genuinely glad you've been here for it. These are not the easiest topics to sit with, and you keep showing up anyway. If you're finding Hot Flasher useful, please hit subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss an episode. New episodes go up every weekday, and I will see you back here Monday.
That's our week. Thanks for listening to Hot Flasher. We'll be back on Monday. Have a great weekend, everyone.